right, we're good to go here today. Thanks for joining us again this week. We are really getting into these Facebook Lives and excited to share them. And so this week we asked Katie Jeffries with First Coast News to come in and sit down with us and join us. Thank you, Katie, for being here. I wanted to tell a little bit of the backstory of how we got started. We were trying to figure it out about 2 years ago, sometime between a year and a half and 2 years ago. I was at your station for the First Coast Living midday show that you guys do, and I was there with Bobby Farah, whose father had been murdered 43 years prior, and an arrest had just happened, or it happened recently, and we were doing some promotion of an event that we were having, but we were talking about the Farah case, Freddie Farah's murder, and being solved 43 years later. And as that segment wrapped up and I was walking off the set and out of the studio, you cornered me and said...
I did. I wanted to do stories about cold cases.
Yeah. You said, I've had this sticky note on my desk for months to do cold cases and how to get started. Can we do something together? And of course, I'm always trying to get publicity for every case that comes across our desk. So I was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do something. And it took us a little while to get,
to figure out how we were going to tell them.
And how we were going to do it. But it's evolved since we started. I mean, I think we did, like the first one you did like a week of cases.
I think so.
3 or 4 cases.
And they were kind of short, like only a minute and a half.
Yeah.
And it was kind of just like the test run of, okay, how are we going to tell these stories? How are we going to do them? And I think I shot and edited those myself, but they were only about a minute and a half that aired in the newscast. But it was enough that the managers really liked it.
Yeah.
And thankfully started putting like more resources and stuff behind it.
Yeah. And now, I mean, your segments are unbelievable. I mean, we do it's called Unsolved on First Coast News, and you do them every other month or so, occasionally. But you do like these 3 to 4 minute, 5 minutes. Some of them have been up to 5 minutes long.
Depending, yeah.
And I mean, that's just unheard of on a news station.
It takes a lot because like your average news story is a minute 15 to a minute 30. So anything over a minute 30, you have to get permission. And a few of them that have been 5 minutes, the way I go into it is I don't tell them how long it is.
Gotcha.
I just make them watch it. And so if they're captivated the whole time, at the end I'll be like, by the way, it's 5 minutes long. But most of the time they're like, well, I was engaged with the story the whole time, so it didn't drag. So then they don't make me cut anything. So that's kind of my little way to get around it. Yeah. Just don't tell them how long it was.
I love that because we don't get that, in any story, in any station, in any city, in any state. Like,
it's hard.
It's like it's impossible, and so like to be able to, it's hard to tell a story in 5 minutes of these victims and their loved ones, which is kind of where we come in. We're always trying to get the family to come in and do an interview with you. And so it's, I always say like it's so hard to do in a minute, or minute 15 seconds to do it justice. And I know you always end up having to leave a lot of footage on the floor.
There's so much because you're like, okay, how do I boil this down to basically like what's the important thing that might help solve it? How do I make sure I tell their story correctly? And get the point across in 3 minutes to 5 minutes, which there's so much like you want to tell. There's so many pieces of the interview you want to show, but you just can't because you're on that time constraint.
Yeah, and who's your camera guy? Is it
Jeffries?
Yeah, that guy does amazing
Phenomenal.
Stuff, and I give him a shout out for sure because he, we see him when we're shooting the interview segments. But then when you go to the scene, and then you always have some other stuff that you guys have done.
Our little recreations we make sometimes.
So, I mean, he has done an amazing job. You guys working together. I mean, we love it when your segments come on because it gives these victims a voice. It gives their families. They know somebody cares, and it's above and beyond. And so we love those. We're really happy that your station likes them and wants to keep doing them.
Well, thank you.
So we've got one here that we want to talk about, which was the most recent, and we want to go back at some point and kind of retouch on some of these other stories that you've already done because one, we should follow up on them,
absolutely.
and kind of give any updates that we might have heard. But two, it's been long enough now that there's people out there that might be watching this that didn't see them when they first aired.
Right.
And our social media reach we're trying to get people outside of just the Jacksonville area. We have cases all over the country. I think we have cases from 44 different states now in our database, and from families that we're helping with these pictures behind us. And we want to inspire some stations across the country to kind of do similar things that you're doing, and get these cases out there and make sure that those families, get the awareness and the publicity that their loved one deserves too. The case that we're going to talk about today is Valerie Ames.
Yes.
And we get Clint to, do we want to show the segment first,
Yeah,
and then we can talk about how it kind of came together?
I agree. Let's see it first, so then y'all know exactly what we're talking about when we kind of go into a little more detail. But this was 1996 when Valerie Ames was found dead in Riverside.
Yeah, let's play that.
The question of why is something that plagues so many who have lost a loved one to murder. It's been on Michelle James' mind for the last 2 decades. Why was her mother viciously murdered when Michelle was just 5 years old? And who did it? These photographs, spread across a table, are all Michelle James has to remember her mother, Valerie Ames. A woman that loved riding horses and camping, but most of all, loved her children.
I was only 5, so I don't remember a whole lot. But I do know that she was about her children. That was her life.
Her sister was 9, Michelle only 5. But Michelle remembers her final moments with her mother at a birthday party.
I was on her lap. It was Barney. I was little. And that was my last time I've seen my mom.
After that, old newsreels tell the story. It was August 10th, 1996. Valerie's body was found inside the Courtyard Apartments on King Street in Riverside. But the apartment was not hers.
The gentleman that was renting the apartment was actually incarcerated the night before Miss Ames was recovered.
Detective Harmony Brooks with the Cold Case Unit at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office says their timeline rules out the man that leased the apartment. But Detective Brooks says after that man's arrest, the apartment was left unlocked. Inside, it was a gruesome crime scene. At 31 years old, Valerie Ames had been stabbed and beaten to death. The murder weapon would never be recovered. Interviews were done, evidence gathered, and leads followed. Detective Brooks has the original case file of around 500 pages. But in time, the case went cold. Stabbings, though, are a personal, close contact crime, which gives Detective Brooks hopes that maybe traces of Valerie's killer were left behind.
Right now what we're concentrating on is the evidence inside the crime scene and the fact that we're 22 years later with greater DNA technology.
With more than 30 pieces of evidence that they can retest for DNA, Detective Brooks is officially reopening this case, something Michelle and her family have always wanted. She says the years have done nothing to numb the pain of losing her mother so violently.
My mom could not be there when I had my babies. My grandmother had to live the rest of her life knowing she buried her daughter.
After more than 20 years, all they want is an answer about who took the life of a young mother in Riverside in 1996.
Help us get a name. Help us end this battle that we've been fighting for so long.
There is no statute of limitations for murder, so if you know anything about the death of Valerie Ames in 1996, please contact the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office or Crime Stoppers, and you can remain anonymous. Katie Jeffries, First Coast News, on your side.
All right, so that was the segment for Valerie Ames, which was the most recent one that we've done here locally.
Yes.
I think you did another one.
We did a couple
from
out of, I think, Clay County, and then one out of Columbia County, but this was the last one we did out of Jacksonville.
Out of Jacksonville. and this kind of started, we have a partnership also with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office that's kind of a three-headed monster. They can bring a lot to the table when they, sit down and they have the case file and can give a little background. I mean, 1996, you were probably like elementary school or something.
Yeah. I was definitely elementary school. And what's great about having, of course, JSO there is, especially with like the Ames case, when y'all first told me the name Valerie Ames, I started Googling, seeing if I could find old articles, anything like that, to like have a base knowledge going in to know what to ask, and I couldn't find anything. I could not find an old news article. I couldn't find, even a picture. I couldn't find anything about her. So I was really glad that JSO, of course, talked to us about it to give us just the basics of what had happened.
That's one of the things when we're dealing with the families and talking with them, a lot of times they come to us and they're like, our loved one is not even on the internet. Like Google knows everything. You can Google anything in the world except our loved one. And that's, that's heartbreaking because they want to know someone else cares. They want to know that there's people out there looking for the person that killed their loved one, and they can't even Google, their loved one's name and find something. So I feel like we're doing another service, to
at
the
least
world.
Get it out there.
Yeah, and now if you Google Valerie Ames,
at least the story will come up,
and somebody knows, and there's something out there, and there's images from that scene. There's obviously the footage from back then we were talking about. You were able to find archive footage.
It's like so if you go into our station, we have a whole back room of just like tapes that are from basically kind of the 80s and 90s, and it's like journeying into Narnia. You're not sure where you're going to find stuff. There's tapes, there's boxes of tapes. So I'm always thankful when I can find video footage from a scene, because I think it adds a lot to the story, but also I think it helps people if they were in that area at the time, kind of like it jogs their memory more.
Right, absolutely.
Because some of those buildings aren't there anymore.
Right.
So hopefully if they were around it and maybe they saw something but they didn't know the name of the victim, or you just hope that maybe something clicks in their head, like, oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that building. I remember that sign.
Right.
And so I always like to have that old video or old pictures, if JSO can share a picture from the scene to add to the story, because I think that helps jog people's memory.
Give us a little insight. How long did this segment take you? How many hours did you put in? I mean, as we go, you usually go one day and you do interviews with law enforcement. We did this interview here in our office with the family. That goes for a little while. You're struggling through these boxes of tapes back at the studio. Then there's editing. You're going back out to the scene in some of these and shooting. I mean, this is a lot of work that goes into one of these. I mean, we're talking about how wonderful it is to get 3.5 to 5 minutes out of it, but that's a lot of footage that's edited down to that.
There is a lot of work, and especially in particular with this story, the day we filmed the interview with Michelle, it was when Hurricane Michael was about maybe 24 hours out from Hurricane Michael. So we had just kind of shot everything we needed for this story, but then everybody had to turn around and do hurricane coverage. So unfortunately, then we had to kind of put that on the back burner and handle hurricane coverage and then circle back to it. But I would say each story, we try to shoot them at least 3 weeks in advance.
Right.
Just because there are other stories, like I wish I could devote all my time to cold cases, but there's other stuff we have to cover, like the hurricanes or other things that happen. So we try to shoot it about 3 weeks in advance. Hours wise, I'd say it's at least like maybe 10 hours or so to interview, then go back and log it, where you just kind of log all the interviews. Writing is always what takes me the longest, because I try to figure out how to condense all of it. And then depending on if we have footage, like at least with this one we had footage, so we could use that in the story. There's other stories where we had nothing, where we had no footage. So then Jeff and I are basically just kind of sitting in a room like, how are we've had 5 minutes and 2 photos. How are we going to make this happen? So that sometimes takes longer, because then we have to figure out like ways to recreate the scenes and stuff like that.
Well, I'm always intrigued when I meet with reporters, because especially television reporters, because what you guys have to do sometimes turn around in a day is a very high stress.
Yes.
I think it takes a very special kind of person to be able to work in that environment. And there's some sacrifices to that. A story that is turned around in a day, you're not going to get the detail and you're not going to get as much. So I love that you schedule these weeks and weeks and weeks out. I don't think anybody gets upset that, hey, we're interviewing today, but it's going to be, a month before it's seen, because it just allows you to do so much more with it. And I think it really adds to the story, and gives a whole picture. And I wanted, people to understand that, like, that is a lot of work that goes into these. And so we just love them, and we, can't say that enough, that don't stop doing, taking your time and digging through those boxes, because it's much appreciated. I know you hear from the families, we hear from the families. Not only does somebody care, but they care enough to put that kind of effort into it, and that's really special. So
I love hearing from the families. I kind of wait after it airs, and I'll like wait by my phone, because I'm hoping I don't want to bother them, but I'm hoping that they'll text me and tell me they like it, because I'm like I just want to make sure they like it, and I hope it brings in information for JSO as well, but I really want the family to like it. That means a lot to me to tell their story, because it's their loved one. If someone was telling my family's story, I'd want them to do it correctly. So it means a lot to me when I get messages back that they like it.
Well, you're doing a great thing, and I know we haven't gotten one person upset about anything. Sometimes you never know. Sometimes the family goes, well, they misspelled my name on the thing, or they said my name wrong, or they, and then you go, well, yeah, did you watch the whole thing? What did you think? Oh, it was the most amazing thing ever, So, we get nothing but positive feedback from these segments. And so back to kind of like how this whole thing comes together. We had created this relationship where we knew we wanted to do this, and it kind of evolved along the way, and we had JSO involved heavily to the point where they have a say in the cases that we do. I mean, we don't always, we need them to participate. And so I tell all our families, like, every name that comes across our desk goes on a list for consideration with these segments. But it's not all up to me, and it's not all up to you. And, there's multiple people at the table kind of making that decision. And this one actually funneled through JSO. They, Michelle had called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to ask for some information on her mom's case. And when they took a look at it, there was enough there, just at a kind of a cursory view, that they thought, this is probably one that we should pull the file out of the vault and assign to a detective, and have them physically look through this and see what evidence is out there, what maybe we still have, and what could be retested. And while we're doing that, this is a good one for our unsolved segment, and so that's kind of how it started. And the family doesn't live in town.
They had to drive in, which I very much appreciated.
They didn't even, it wasn't a question, because we always give them options. Well, maybe we can do a Skype interview, or maybe we can meet halfway. They didn't live too far away, a couple hours away.
Met in, in Lake City
or something. We try to make it easy for them, but we're coming, which
I always appreciate, especially when it was like leading up to Hurricane Michael. I was like, I understand if y'all can't make it.
And they live out that direction, so we were like, if you have other things that you need to attend to, no big deal. And they said, nope, we're packed up, we're on our way. And they came in, Valerie's daughter and Valerie's mother. Valerie's mother didn't really want to do the interview part of it, but she wanted to be here. And Valerie's daughter, Michelle, who was a child
when her 5 at the time,
when her mother was murdered, and those always, we talked about Bobby Farah earlier, and I always remember him. He only has so many memories of his dad, because for the first few years of your life you don't remember, and then you have just a few more years and they're taken, and so anytime I hear those stories about a child that lost a parent. I mean, obviously I can relate, because I lost a parent, but I was 31, when that happened. I had 31 years of memories to go with that. I think about all those memories that are stolen, you know what I mean? And I think about that when I'm playing with my kids. Like, my son's only a year old now, and I'm like, you got to start remembering this stuff, because
lock this away in your
lock
memory.
this away. My daughter's 4, and she does remember things, and it's like, you rob these families of so many things, and so when she comes in and you can just see the pain and anguish that she's had her life.
Because it had been 24 years since it happened, but it's still very, very raw emotions for family.
And we've been talking with her, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. Like, it's been hard for her to go back through, but it's also been very rewarding and seeing that people care, and knowing that there are people looking for her mother's killer. And it's almost like grieving almost for the first time. I mean, I don't want to speak for her, but it's like when you're a child, you're resilient. You don't know that this doesn't happen to everybody.
Yeah.
You just have to deal with it. And then you get older and you start to realize what you lost out on. And your mom wasn't there when you got married and when your children were born. And, you know, all those milestones in Michelle's life that she missed out on. And her sister as well. She had an older sister.
Who was 9.
Who was 9. And she has a few more memories, but still, you know, not enough. They deserved more.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, she took that initiative to call the sheriff's office and ask. And, you know, it really ended up here where we were able to, I mean, again, and Michelle is watching with us, you know, so
hey,
Michelle, we hope that you enjoy what we're able to do. And we know you're appreciative because you talk to us and talk to Patty all the time. And thank you for kind of making that step. That can be very difficult. One of the things, you know, our role in this, we're not on camera. We're not behind the camera, but we're usually there supporting these families with these interviews. And we've had families in the past that have panicked at the last second, or that didn't want to follow through, or were scared. Or sometimes they're just, you know, they feel
it's
maybe
hard to talk about.
It's hard to talk about, and it can be you know, you don't want to be crying on camera or something, and you know, but you know, that's the reality that they're living. I mean, that's what we live.
And I think it's important, especially, you know, it's important, of course, to have the facts of the case, but I think almost as important, if not more important, is to show who the victim was, rather than just, you know, she was a woman who was killed in an apartment in Riverside in 1996. People watching don't connect with that, but then you tell them, well, she was a mother. She had 2 young daughters. She loved horses. She loved dancing. She, you know, she loved her children. The last memory her youngest daughter has is of the birthday party. You know, that is what takes someone, if you're just watching at home, or maybe you think you have information, that's what makes someone who passed away, I almost feel, more real to the viewer, because you can connect with those things. And that's what, I mean, you can't always get that from a report. You can only get that from family, which is why I always find them so crucial to stories.
And that it is so important, and it's why we're appreciative of what you do, because one thing that we've learned is that you want to create that connection. People have to be able to relate. If they can't relate,
then they don't
care. Yeah, it's not as important to them. And so when you realize that something that happened in 1996 has this long-term impact and effect on somebody, and then you look at these pictures and you think, gosh, that looks like us Easter weekend, you know, I had a horse, or I rode a horse that looked like that, or, you know, that looks like my cousin or my neighbor,
like taking pictures holding their first baby, you
right
know?
Yeah, all of a sudden these are real people, and that's what we want to convey is we live in a society where violence is prominent, and we can become immune to it, and it just becomes so commonplace that it's flippant and joking. Oh, another murder. You know what I mean? And we don't want it to be like that.
It becomes very, if it didn't happen to me or someone I know, then I'm not going to work. Which, it's like, if there's one person lost in the community, it's one too many. You know, we should all care. Exactly. And you know, I mean, you nailed it. It's important to us because it's our loved one, but we need it to be important to everybody. And there's only certain ways that you can do that. And telling these stories and showing that emotion and showing pictures that everybody can relate to. I mean, everybody has a photo album with those kinds of those outfits, those hairdos, right,
you know,
of the 90s.
The 90s, you know, it personalizes it. And you know, we you know, particularly the people here in Jacksonville, this is our community, you know, and so we have an opportunity here to make our community better and safer. And we can do that by watching these segments, by sharing them on social media. If you have information, by
Come
coming
forward.
forward. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, call in the tip if you know. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about that case. The scene is a different apartment complex now.
It was. We went by the area and I couldn't really tell if it was the same, so that's why we only used the old footage, because I figured, okay, that's the visual cue. But it was the Courtyard Apartments in 1996 over in the Riverside area, and so leading up to where she was found, they said the person who actually leased that apartment at the time had been arrested the day before. So had been arrested on Friday, but the apartment had been left unlocked.
Right.
And that she had been found inside there on Saturday. So they don't believe the person who owned the apartment was involved, but rather it was just left unlocked.
Right.
But with her case specifically, because it was violent, it was a stabbing, it's a very close contact crime. So they said they still had a lot of pieces, I think she said 36 pieces of evidence, or more than 30 pieces of evidence, that they can retest now for DNA, because it was it was all indoors in a very close contact area. So they can now retest that for DNA. And she said, and they also had more witness interviews as she was going through the file of people that she wanted to follow up with. And that was some of the big reasons they were able to reopen it, is because they had viable leads that they could still kind of chase down.
That's what they're always looking for. When Michelle called in and asked for an update, unfortunately, there's going to be times where a family does that and they look at the case and they go,
"There's just nothing."
There's nothing here that we can do that we haven't done in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
But if there is something, I mean, all that evidence, technology is moving at lightning speed.
Oh yeah.
So they can submit that evidence now. They probably can't submit it all at once. They have to submit a little bit at a time.
It takes time. It really, I know, because I've even gotten anxious calling up JSO, being like, "Have you gotten anything back so we can do an update?" And it takes time to do all that.
And that's one of the things we've been asking, like, let's do some updates on these. And they start looking through the file and they go, okay, well, we submitted all that.
Hasn't been tested yet.
We haven't gotten anything back. So there's nothing really to update. And I know the families are anxious because, all of a sudden after years and years of nothing,
there's a glimmer of hope.
There's a glimmer of hope. And all of a sudden we went from, you can't even Google Valerie Ames' name and get anything, to it's on TV. You know what I mean? It's on social media.
Mm-hmm.
It's being talked about again. I see these families, they'll share the segments on social media, and inevitably there's someone that comments and says, "Oh, I didn't even know
that hadn't been solved."
That had been solved, or that your mom was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, it's not the first thing we say as survivors when we meet somebody. "Oh, hey, I'm Ryan and my dad was murdered," and sometimes you want to talk about it, you want people to talk about it, but you don't want to scare people off. And, there are people, I've had conversations where having a good conversation, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And then I tell them, and it's like radio silent, and
they're like, "I don't know how to respond."
And they're like, "Oh, okay." Moving on, and that's, for someone that doesn't have my personality, that could be offensive and it could hurt their feelings a little bit. For me, luckily, I don't have to deal with that too much. But then there's other times where I was on the phone with the bug guy this morning, and talking about my house, like, "Hey, can you come and spray the yard?" And he's like, "What does Project Oak gonna do?" And I was like, "How do you even know? Like, where did you see that?"
Did you Google me?
Yeah, did you Google me while we were on the phone? And then we had a 10-minute conversation about Project Cold Case.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you never know who you're talking to. He immediately starts telling me about a family friend that they grew up with in Arizona that was an unsolved case for 40 years, and a couple of years ago they solved it.
Wow.
And so you just you it's weird because you want to talk about your loved one, but you don't want the room to go silent. You don't want people to look at you like you have three heads, and it's a balancing act. And so it's always interesting when you see somebody comment and say, "I didn't even know that had happened," and you go, "Well, yeah, that's not something I talk about every day, but it's something I think about every day, but not necessarily something I talk about." And as you mentioned with this case, the guy that lives in the apartment is literally arrested the day before, and kind of creates this alibi for him because
he was in custody.
He was in custody when the murder happens, but it also creates some avenues to look in because
who would know it was unlocked?
Who would know it was unlocked? Do you just go walking around checking doorknobs? But in that close contact, there's there's evidence there that can be tested that hasn't been tested in a long time, and I know, we always say there's a very thin line between hope and false hope, but we always want these families to have hope.
Yeah.
And that's what you provide when you give these segments, and we never know if somebody's gonna call up, or and not getting in to detail, but you have done segments where law enforcement has called you afterwards and said, like, okay,
there was something useful that came out of it.
Yeah, something useful came out of that.
And that always makes me feel good too, because I'm like, all right.
Yeah, and that for our families, and it's hard for us because sometimes we know this stuff and we can't share it yet, and because that would jeopardize, there's not an arrest.
The progress maybe they made.
The progress that they could make. So sometimes we have to just sit back and
and just wait
and wait. And sometimes hopefully it'll be enough that it leads to an arrest in a case, and then sometimes it may not be, but we're always trying to get these cases up to current investigative standards, so that once all of this stuff is tested, if unfortunately they're not able to identify a suspect and make an arrest in the Valerie Ames case, in a few years, when new technology is out there, or technology is even better, they'll be able to look back at that case and say, okay, in 2018, they did everything they could up to what was available at 2018.
Right.
So we don't have to go back through all of that stuff. Now, what has changed from 2018 to whatever date that is, and what can we do now? We've got this genetic genealogy thing is a huge tool right now.
Right. That's how they solved the Golden State Killer.
The Golden State Killer. And it has, it just is snowballed into, arrest after arrest, whether it's a murder or a rape. And for those of you that don't know the details of that, it's basically when you do 23andMe and Ancestry.com and you get those results back, those are private within those businesses. They're not selling your information and they're not providing it publicly. But then when you get that information back, you have the option to publicly upload it to a database, which was traditionally used to find relatives.
Yeah.
To find, adopted.
Because then you're kind of releasing that information.
You're releasing that information. And the goal was always to find other people.
Yeah.
So you, maybe it was just building a family tree and you wanted to know what segment of your family branched off and, went out west.
Right.
But then beyond that, people that were adopted,
try and track back family.
Track back family, or somebody that maybe, I had this situation with my neighbor. Her mother had never talked about her dad. She didn't know who her dad was, and she submitted her DNA to this public database and found a sibling.
Wow.
That she didn't know she had, and she was in her 80s at the time. So that's kind of what that database was used for. And then somebody in law enforcement decided, I wonder if I submit this bad guy's DNA, if it will show up. And it typically doesn't show up to the bad guy. It typically shows up
member.
To the bad guy's family member, and then they're able to take that information and that doesn't equal an arrest. You can't just because.
But it narrows the pool.
But now all of a sudden you have a focus, and you can stop chasing down red herrings and whatever information that somebody submitted, and you can focus on that individual and either eliminate them or arrest them.
Yeah.
So Michelle did ask if anything came back from the DNA testing, and to our knowledge,
no. And it's one of the stories that definitely we're going to call and follow up on. But to our knowledge, unfortunately not. And again, DNA testing, I think they were about to send in the testing when we did the story, and that was in November. So
it probably
if I had to guess, it hasn't made it yet.
It most likely it has not been tested. It's not that it didn't result in anything, it's that it hasn't actually been tested. One of the things we've learned with doing these and just from our information with law enforcement, our conversations, is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement handles almost exclusively all of the testing for DNA evidence and other evidence, fingerprints and that kind of stuff. But they're doing that for every single criminal case.
Yeah, Amber Alerts, rapes, murders, and they have to triage it.
They have to triage it. They have different Jacksonville, we actually have our own FDLE lab here, but most cities don't. They have, a regional lab that they can send stuff to. So it's easy to get backlogged. And kind of the nature of what we're dealing with, and one of the reasons we work so hard with cold cases is because it's easy for them to fall down the priority list when there's, last year there was the serial killer in Tampa that was going around shooting people. If a child goes missing,
right.
There are things that could happen. If they fear for a public safety issue, those are going to take priorities over everything. Murders are still happening, pretty regularly. A lot of times those hot cases, they call them, take priority. And I think that's starting to change. I think part of it's starting to change because of all the publicity we're able to get, and these the powers that be see the families that are left behind and realize that they didn't just move on and forget about this, that this is still very important to them, and they still truly believe that there are people looking for the person that killed their loved one. But that all being said, it is not uncommon for it to take 6 months to get a response on an active case, a hot case. A cold case, could be 3 months, could be 6 months, it could be a year. I know I talked to some detectives from other agencies that were saying that they had submitted stuff a year prior that had not been assigned yet and tested. So, Michelle, it's not that it has been tested and didn't come back anything. At this point, I'm thinking it has not even been tested, or surely the results are not back if it has. So we're still holding out hope for the testing with 30 plus items.
Yeah.
If they don't get anything on the first, I think they can only submit 4 or 5 items at a time. So if they don't get anything on those,
at least they still have more options.
They'll send the next 5, and if they don't get anything on those, they'll send the next 5 until they've tested all those items. Hopefully that won't be necessary. Hopefully in those first few items they'll get
a hit or something.
They'll get a hit, and they'll be able to start narrowing their focus, which is always our goal and why we're doing that. And we should say, if there's anybody out there that watched that segment and does have information on this case, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, you can call 630-0500, call the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, or you can call Crime Stoppers at
1-800-845-TIPS.
Tips.
188. 188.
Yeah.
845-TIPS. I'm like, I've said it enough times in the newscast.
Yeah. And that's eligible for a reward.
And you can remain anonymous.
Yeah,
you don't have to give your name. We've done a couple stories about how that works. I mean, when you call, it's actually, I believe, a phone bank in Canada.
Yeah.
They just take down your information, what law enforcement agency. They don't ask your name or anything. They just take your tip down, say thank you. They'll give you a number, and that's the number you would take to the bank. They give you a number, and then that's it. And then they send that to the law enforcement. If it comes back as something that helps, law enforcement lets Crime Stoppers know. Crime Stoppers sends the money to the bank under the number, that specific number that you were given, and that's how you pick up your money. So you never have to give your name.
That's it. And remember, this is a tip that leads to an arrest.
Yes.
So, we've had situations, where a reward might be after conviction,
and that can take time.
Our office was in court a couple weeks ago for the Tammy Welch case, which was 34 years old, and they had made an arrest. But they made an arrest in 2013 in that case.
Yeah.
So it took 5+ years for that case to go to trial. So you can imagine if somebody calls in a tip because they need money and they're willing to turn on somebody that they knew or used to know, they may not do it if they've got to wait 5 years to get paid. And Crime Stoppers cuts that out. Crime Stoppers, believes that if it's a good enough information for law enforcement to make an arrest, then they're gonna do it.
Michelle looks like she's writing in here. She's saying that her life has been so sad without her mom, missed the birth of her children, missed her wedding, missed my sister's children's birth, and I think that's so important, for people to remember. It's so difficult for the victims, especially, when I say victims, I mean, survivors too, because you have to move forward, especially if the case is unsolved. Sometimes that leaves an emptiness, not being able to know exactly what happened, but then to miss so much of it when you go to other weddings who have, their mom there, or other births who have their mom being able to be there. So
yeah, I mean, you can't, unless you have gone through it. I'll never know what it's like to not have my dad walk me down the aisle. That's something that a woman, though, that lost a father, I mean, that's a huge part of life, and when you have children and you have questions, believe me, I have two children. I have lots of questions. When you don't have a mother to turn to, to ask those questions. Michelle says how much she missed with him growing up and how important it is, to her and her sister.
They deserve an answer
to get that solved. They do. This doesn't go away. They don't get to just decide now that, well, mom was murdered and no one cares, so it's not going to affect me anymore. I mean, it is still something that they think about daily. It's something that impacts their lives. It's something that impacts the way they raise their children. The fear of them not being able to be there for their children because that's what happened to them. What goes on inside a survivor's head when they're left with these unanswered questions. And look, no arrest or conviction is going to bring Valerie Ames back, and the family knows that. But you start to create scenarios in your head of what happened, why somebody got away with it. You know that somebody knows. Somebody out there knows. There was, somebody walked into an apartment that wasn't theirs, and killed a human being, and then left. So an apartment complex, you got to think there was people that may have saw something, heard something, that maybe they were scared to come forward then. But we're now decades removed from that.
And that's another thing I hope the stories do raise awareness, that people who maybe lived in that apartment complex who didn't realize it was never solved, maybe they thought, oh, someone else will tell them about the person we saw, and that doesn't happen. So hopefully it'll raise awareness for people who either knew something back then, or as Dan Jansen, one of the JSO officer detectives, has told us before, relationships change in decades. Somebody who maybe their boyfriend told them about something and they didn't want to come forward then because that was who they were dating, but they're not dating them anymore. We hope that they maybe see one of the segments we do and say, I didn't realize that case was never solved, and then can come forward. So you hope that with all the time that has passed, hopefully that does make people want to come forward. They're not afraid of maybe that person anymore, or they realize that no, it was never solved, and maybe they hold the key.
Yeah, and so like one of those things, law enforcement doesn't and they can't release all the information. So like if somebody thinks, well, all I know is that it was a brown Datsun, and you think that's not going to help. Well, law enforcement may have a suspect, and I'm not speaking about the Valerie Ames case specifically. I'm just generalities here. They may know that individual drove that car,
but they needed someone to confirm.
They need somebody to be able to say that was the car at the scene. So it can be something so simple that you think is not important, but we don't know what all law enforcement has. So anything. I mean, we stress it, and I think people sometimes are like, all I saw was,
I saw one
generic.
maybe, shadowy person who was walking around this area. It's like, well, just call and tell them that.
Right.
'Cause you never know.
Let law enforcement decide whether that is
what's important and what's not.
And what's not. That's what they get paid for. They'll do the investigation. They'll do the detective work. But we want them to have as much information as they can to move forward, because we see this. You talk about a sad situation, or sad situation even worse, is sometimes law enforcement knows who did it and they don't have enough evidence to prosecute, to make an arrest. And what if that's all they needed was somebody that was willing to take the stand and say, oh, it was a brown Datsun. I saw that person peeling out of the apartment complex parking lot. And that could be the difference in a murderer being free and justice,
and
for a victim.
We've covered a couple of those where, when we were doing the interview with police, you could tell they had kind of zeroed in on a suspect, even though they hadn't officially named them suspect. They had their eye on somebody, but they just didn't have enough yet to, make it stand in a court of law. So you hope that after it airs, maybe somebody would come forward to help reaffirm who that person was, or you wait and see what that person does after the story airs, because
Right.
a lot of people think, oh, it's been 2 decades, no
Right.
one remembers now. People,
Yeah, it's not
people
in the
forgotten.
news. It's not
Right.
on Google. It's on
And
the
then
internet.
you do a whole story. There's promotions behind it, and you hope that that makes that person sweat a little bit, and either do something
Yeah.
stupid, or maybe they'll come forward and confess.
Right, right. No, exactly. And I know, Michelle mentions that they want a name. They want to know. They want to be able to put a face with the person that did this,
And ask them why.
And ask them why. And and you're not always guaranteed to get those answers, but somebody that would do that to a mother, they
It
don't
was-
deserve to be out here with us walking the streets.
Right. It was a very violent crime. And Michelle knows that, and her sister knows that. It was a very vicious crime. And whoever did that, you're right, does not deserve to be walking around free, does not deserve to not have this on their record. Because, they took away so much from Michelle and her sister.
Yeah, yeah. There's no, you can't justify those actions. You know what I mean? This was a young woman who had 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to just take them and then go about your life and
Right.
live. You have to face the consequences of those actions. That person made a decision that day, and that decision rippled and impacted lives that he will never know.
Yeah.
And I still don't know how people can go 20, 30, 40 years and
Not have that eat away at their conscience.
and not have that eat away at them. But we've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen people that, I never told a soul, and I never told, the Freddie Farrah case, that guy was a street performer in New Orleans, and literally spent every day standing still in his own mind. And to me, that would be the last place I would want to be if I'd ever done something to hurt somebody,
To just think about it.
think about it. So, I'm not built like like a killer, luckily, but those, somewhere out there is a person that did that, and it's not fair to Valerie's children and her mother, who's still alive, who's still stayed in the background, but has a very vested interest in knowing who killed her daughter.
She had to bury her daughter.
She had to bury her daughter, and she was so stoic when she was here. She was a little nervous to go on camera, but she wanted to see what was going on, and it was you could just see it pulling on her heartstrings as well. That she never asked to be in this position, and certainly,
The death of anyone's child is terrible, but I think to have them, of course, to have them murdered is like another level of pain.
Yeah. It's really hard to explain, but I think with these stories and these segments, people are getting a glimpse into that life. I think as naive as it is when you think about it, that Michelle is still impacted. This, you think, oh well, it's been so long, 22 years, like what, surely she's moved on. No, that's not how this works. She is the person she is today because of what happened to her mother.
Right.
Who knows?
She's in law enforcement.
She's in law enforcement, and she, is an amazing person. One of the things that I've learned as I've advocated for these families and tried to help raise awareness for these cases is some of the most amazing human beings I have ever met I would have never met, except they have gone through the absolute worst thing that could happen to somebody. They've lost a loved one to murder. They've lost a child. Just amazing people that but for murder, I would never know them. And that's be sometimes hard to wrestle with, that these are great human beings. They're doing wonderful things. They're helping their community. They're working hard in society, and they probably wanted to give up a lot of them a lot of times, and wanted to ask, why me? Why do I have to go through this? Why did my mom or my loved one have to go through this? And, it's a tragic story always, when we hear them, but to see how much,
it still affects families so far down the line.
Yeah. And to see what they're able to do. Michelle, she said it, so we'll say it. She works for the Department of Corrections.
Yeah.
And she's with these criminals every day. And I've gone and spoken to inmates before, and that was a very kind of, it was an internal struggle. You know, I was sitting with people that had killed other human beings, and I remember thinking they probably have done things they weren't caught for.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that was my role in there, was I was talking to these inmates, was taking responsibility. You know, that there are people you have left in your wake, you know.
Or if you know something, if you
or
had a
someone
cellmate
you know.
who told you.
Right, to come forward. You know, Michelle works with these inmates every day. She's not, and that's something special, because a lot of people would have a bunch of anger and think that everybody that's in prison is a horrible human being that deserves, you know, to rot in hell or something, you know, and I think she'd probably tell you that you know, you can't just group everybody together as being horrible. Somebody, you know, when you murder somebody, it's a pretty safe bet that you're a bad human being, you know. But she still puts her life on the line every day and goes out there as much to protect those inmates and make sure that they're taken care of. And what does that say about somebody that lost their mother and that, you know, is in there taking care of people that have taken other people's lives? You know, I mean, she's a special person, and I'm sure that took some getting used to and grappling with internally.
Yeah. And we just hope that you really hope that somebody who does know something, that they do come forward. There's so many avenues now. You know, you can call the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, or you can call Crime Stoppers. I think there's a way on Crime Stoppers to submit maybe an online tip as well. Tips. So, I mean, there's no reason to keep that information to yourself, if nothing else, but like to cleanse your soul of it.
Right.
Especially if you know something, even if you weren't involved, but you know who did it. I mean, maybe I'm just someone who's a little bit more firm than other people, but I feel like if you know who did it and you don't say anything, you're just as guilty.
Just as guilty. Yeah, I have a hard time with that. I really do. You know, we're talking about public safety here. You know, I mean, we're talking about the lives of all of us and all of our loved ones. If somebody can do this once and get away with it,
what's to stop them from doing it again?
What's them to stop? And what if they live in your neighborhood, you know, or what if they find themselves around someone you care about?
Right.
You know, and there's an opportunity there for them to do something bad. So you know, it really is a selfish thing to keep that back, and you're putting a lot of other lives in danger. And sometimes you just have to stand up and do what's right, and not for the reward.
Yeah.
You know,
but
just to do it. But you know, hey, $3,000 wouldn't hurt.
If that's what motivates people to come forward, then by all means, take the money, give the name, take the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we again, just kind of a recap of this case. 1996, Riverside area. Valerie Ames.
It was the Courtyard Apartments in 1996. Valerie Ames, she was a young mom. She was blonde. These are some actually young pictures of her.
Yeah.
She was blonde. She was a mother of two. A daughter was 5. Her other daughter was 9. That's her on the left here with her mom, actually, enjoying pizza. This is her riding her horse, because they said she loved to ride horses. And I believe she had worked maybe on a ranch. This was an Easter picture where you can see Michelle and her sister along with their mom. And then, look at it, just kind of making a funny face. But it shows personality. And this is her with her first child, so Michelle's older sister. So we really hope that people come forward. We hope that the pictures maybe jog your memory. You can watch my story online if you want to see more scene video. But it was the Courtyard Apartments, 1996, August 10th of 1996. She was found in that apartment along King Street, unfortunately beaten and stabbed to death. And it was an unlocked apartment. The person who had leased that apartment had been arrested the day before, so it had been left unlocked, and then she was found inside of it. So JSO didn't give me specifics about why they thought she was there or why she was in that area, but they don't believe the person who leased it was involved, but rather it was just left unlocked.
Right. And so, you know, again, if you have information on this case, if you have information on other cases, any case, please do the right thing and call. Crime Stoppers is a national, you know, organization. You can get the number I think all of their numbers are 845 tips.
Yeah.
But they have, so like you said, it goes to a
phone bank in Canada, who
Canada
sends out the information.
and they'll get it to the right people. Local law enforcement, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office is 904-630-0500.
And I think people are often afraid of the police department too, maybe, or maybe intimidated to come forward. They're very nice.
They are.
Detective Brooks that I spoke with is so nice. Also, Detective Dan Jansen, he's super nice as well. So I think you'll find that if you have information, you come forward. There's no need to be afraid.
No.
They're very, very nice.
They are nice, and their goal is to solve this case, resolve this case, get this family answers, and get a bad guy off the streets.
Right.
So that's a common goal. It doesn't have to be a loved one to
They're
want the
gonna be
bad
thankful
guy
you're
off
there.
the streets. Yeah, exactly. So you're doing a service to your community, and the family. I mean,
It would mean the world to them. It's
beyond the world. These families have struggled long enough. Michelle and her sister and Valerie's mom, they deserve to know who did this, and they deserve to get their day in court, and to get some semblance of justice. They're not naive enough to think that anything's going to bring their loved one back. I mean, they know, but justice is important. Answers are important. Living life without those things is incredibly difficult. So that's why we're doing this. We're going to do this some more. We have
several cases.
We have a backlog of cases that you have done segments on that we want to.
I think over 25. It's been a lot.
It's been a lot, and we're going to start working on some new ones. In fact, as soon as we finish here,
we're going to talk about the next set.
We'll talk about the next set, which will be
probably
early
February
next year. Yeah. That gives time for us to identify some cases. And for you to go through the process that you do and dig through all those archives.
I'll journey back into Narnia, find those tapes.
Yeah, exactly. Gosh, you guys need an intern or something.
I keep saying, I'm like, because you go in there and it's just like, this is boxes 1994. I'm like, great.
Wonderful.
Let's see how we can go through this.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Katie, for coming out here and being a part of this. I think this is really going to take off. We were talking about it before we started that. Like we toyed with the idea of doing a podcast, and we actually recorded a couple of podcasts, and then we're just like, we're jumping into a world where
there's already, and it's hard. You want people to see.
We want to show pictures. Yeah. We want people to see these segments that we've done, if we have them, to be able to show news clippings. We ask these families to provide us with multiple pictures. So that somebody can relate. Somebody can say, that looks like somebody I know, or I'm related to, or that I care about.
Or recognize them from back then,
If we have a composite sketch, we want to be able to show that stuff, and you just can't do that on a podcast. And we may strip the audio out of this stuff and put it in a podcast format that'll hopefully drive people back to these videos. So I really appreciate everybody that watched live and that will watch later on, because I know it's the middle of the day during the week.
Or who shares it later. The more you share it, the more awareness it gets out there, and that's important.
That is. We tell people, we don't need 1 million people to see it. We need one, the right one. But it may have to go through 1 million people to get to that one. And you never know that, look, we don't always get recognition for the good work that we do. We don't know that Facebook post or tweet that we share, retweet, could be the difference in solving a crime and not. Right. And we may never know that it was ours that did it, but I mean, that's enough for me. Just knowing that as long as it gets solved and those families get some answers, we're thrilled with it. And again, thank you so much for coming out straight off the
I was afraid I wasn't going to make it.
Yeah, you were anchoring the 12 o'clock, the noon news, and then had to dart over here, but luckily we're pretty close by. You're the closest station to our office.
That's true.
So.
Just down the block.
Yeah. So, but thanks so much. We look forward to having you back. And working on some of these other cases that we've did. Real quick, I just want to throw out there that we're having our annual Year of Hope event January 26th here in Jacksonville, Florida, at the Life Well Celebrated Center at 1601 Oaklawn Place. That's off San Jose Boulevard. We do this every year. It's a fundraiser for Project Cold Case, but it's also an opportunity for us to reflect back on the cases that we've helped families with and kind of set some goals for the year to come. We've got big plans in place for 2019, helping more people, doing that in more ways. It's a free event. We don't sell tickets. We provide some food. There's a cash bar. We're going to have some silent live auctions.
I'll be there.
Katie's going to be there and help us.
There.
And I wanted to show this. This is one of the things that we're going to auction off.
Nice.
Yeah, check this out. We now have a Project Cold Case football helmet that was provided to us by Green Gridiron up in Greenville, South Carolina. And they do all the what do they call it?
Face masks?
Yeah, they put all reconditioned face masks for pretty much every football team in the country, whether it's high school or whatever. And they do these custom helmets sometimes. And they're actually going to be doing they have a YouTube channel, and they're going to show the build that they did. They
cool.
custom painted this for us, and they're going to show that on their YouTube channel probably Saturday, but maybe
that's nice.
Yeah, this is your sneak peek. So this showed up from FedEx Friday, and we're going to auction this thing off and see if anybody thinks it's as cool as we do.
I love that. That's so neat.
So thanks to Green Gridiron, we're starting to get these auction items in. Probably the week leading up to the event, we'll do one of these Facebook Lives, and we'll start showing everybody the stuff that they can come and bid on. And yeah, so that's, I never thought I'd see my organization's logo on a football helmet, but there it is.
That's sweet.
So that's pretty cool. All right. Thanks again, Katie. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching. We'll see you guys hopefully next week.
The question of why is something that plagues so many who have lost a loved one to murder. It's been on Michelle James' mind for the last 2 decades. Why was her mother viciously murdered when Michelle was just 5 years old? And who did it? These photographs, spread across a table, are all Michelle James has to remember her mother, Valerie Ames. A woman that loved riding horses and camping, but most of all, loved her children.
I was only 5, so I don't remember a whole lot. But I do know that she was about her children. That was her life.
Her sister was 9, Michelle only 5. But Michelle remembers her final moments with her mother at a birthday party.
I was on her lap. It was Barney. I was little. And that was my last time I've seen my mom.
After that, old newsreels tell the story. It was August 10th, 1996. Valerie's body was found inside the Courtyard Apartments on King Street in Riverside. But the apartment was not hers.
The gentleman that was renting the apartment was actually incarcerated the night before Miss Ames was recovered.
Detective Harmony Brooks with the Cold Case Unit at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office says their timeline rules out the man that leased the apartment. But Detective Brooks says after that man's arrest, the apartment was left unlocked. Inside, it was a gruesome crime scene. At 31 years old, Valerie Ames had been stabbed and beaten to death. The murder weapon would never be recovered. Interviews were done, evidence gathered, and leads followed. Detective Brooks has the original case file of around 500 pages. But in time, the case went cold. Stabbings, though, are a personal, close contact crime, which gives Detective Brooks hopes that maybe traces of Valerie's killer were left behind.
Right now, what we're concentrating on is the evidence inside the crime scene and the fact that we're 22 years later with greater DNA technology.
With more than 30 pieces of evidence that they can retest for DNA, Detective Brooks is officially reopening this case, something Michelle and her family have always wanted. She says the years have done nothing to numb the pain of losing her mother so violently.
My mom could not be there when I had my babies. My grandmother had to live the rest of her life knowing she buried her daughter.
After more than 20 years, all they want is an answer about who took the life of a young mother in Riverside in 1996.
Help us get a name. Help us end this battle that we've been fighting for so long.
There is no statute of limitations for murder, so if you know anything about the death of Valerie Ames in 1996, please contact the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office or Crime Stoppers, and you can remain anonymous. Katie Jeffries, First Coast News, on your side.